Helen, from your work in both archaeology and cognitive science, what can we say about human nature, human uniqueness?
The paleoanthropologist Tim White once quipped that if you had, never will you see on the cover of National Geographic or of Science or of Nature a skull of a pig and saying, new pig skull find completely overthrows all our preconceptions about suet evolution. Like you just don't see it, whereas you do regularly see sort of pictures of finds of human fossils, hominin fossils, and tools that talk about how we completely have to rethink our past. So there is a kind of, there is an interest, a focused interest in human evolution, in hominin evolution, because it tells us something about ourselves. And so the first thing to think about when you think about human uniqueness and archaeology is that you can't take it loose of the fact that we are very much interested in ourselves. We want to learn more about ourselves, and that's why we look in the past and we project our own ideas onto the past, right? So you had, like, in the 50s, 60s, you had the idea of man the hunter, although that was a bit of a joking sort of title. You had a big conference on man the hunter. You had the idea of sort of like murderous apes. And then you had the idea about, like, you know, peaceful humans who lived in communities with Glenn Isaac. So you have to be always cognizant that looking at the archaeological evidence, that we sort of read into it in part what we find interesting about ourselves or how we conceive of ourselves. So it's like a mirror of how we conceive of ourselves. Nonetheless, I do think that we can learn so much from paleoanthropology that it really tells us something about who we are today. So,
can you divide it into categories in terms of absolutely modern humans and then right before that, and then comparison, which is a lot of recent work in Neanderthals and other, other cognate species?
I think for a very long time there was this idea of cultural modernity, and I think that idea is still very much alive. And for the longest time, I was very much on board with this idea. The idea is briefly this: that at some point, a spectacular change occurred in human evolution. And all of a sudden, we all started talking and making art and making complex tools. But I think that a lot of the work of African Middle Stone Age cultures, and particularly also very recently in Indonesia and Sulawesi, have sort of overturned this idea of cultural modernity into something more gradual. So it seems like, so there was the idea that even though humans were anatomically modern, at least 100,000 years, and now maybe as much as 300,000 years, that cultural modernity was much more recent. And so the evidence for that was like the great rock art in France and the sculptures in southwest Germany. But now we see a sort of more gradual picture. So humans have, anatomically modern humans have gone out of Africa a lot earlier than we thought. And they also started doing these things, making art, making beads, for example. You have beads in Morocco and in the Levant of about 135,000. So it's a much more gradual process. There's also all this recent work on Neanderthals, so it's difficult with the chronology, right? Because we don't know exactly like how much cultural diffusion there was, and a lot of recent work has tried to establish that, yes, Neanderthals could do this stuff before they met anatomically modern Homo sapiens. So there is, the very concept of a creative explosion has to be sort of nuanced. There is a more gradual picture and that doesn't make it any less spectacular. I think that even so, it's still interesting to ask, like, why did Homo sapiens make art? What does this tell us about ourselves? Like, it's super interesting that we make this art. And the interesting thing is when we then look at what really matters, when we want to see what is really and truly human, we say it's art. You know, it's other things like music, for example, old musical instruments. It's not that we're sort of looking and saying, look, they butchered a lot more animals in those days than they do now, than they did earlier. Look how much more productive they were. So we really seem to be finding things like art and music, a religion as well, as somehow really defining of us.
What's the now earliest art that can be determined for Homo sapiens?
It's again difficult to say what is meant with art. So if you're looking like at sort of pictorial art, then I think that the earliest definite one is a painting of a pig in Sulawesi on a cave of about 45,000 years old, and that was found a few years ago. So that's significantly older than the oldest rock art in Europe, which is a bit over 40,000 or sort of late 30s. But then if you say, okay, how about beads? You know, beads that are intentionally made, people making holes in, that is a lot older. So that's at least 135,000. If you then look at like maybe ochre, maybe people putting ochre on their bodies, like in a non-functional way, then you have caves in Southern Africa that are even older. So that's like, don't know the exact date anymore, but that's like close to 200,000. So it depends a bit on what we mean with art.
And there is some controversy whether Neanderthals had art, and I think recently people think that they did.
Yeah, so I think the evidence is actually pretty clear that Neanderthals had body decoration, that they had art. I think it's still interesting to wonder, like, how did the art function for them? How did the art function for Homo sapiens? So for Homo sapiens, and this is an older theory by Margaret Conkey, but I think the theory really works. The theory is that a lot of this rock art was not like, you know, you have a beautiful home and you put, like, people didn't live there, and you put paintings there, but rather people would come from all sorts of parts of the neighboring areas, and they would come together in a large aggregation site. And there they would exchange ideas. They would, exchange tools, and they would exchange, just sort of like strategies about how to deal with the environment. And the art can be seen in that sort of context of people coming together. So it also talks about, it shows very clearly community. Now, Neanderthals lived in smaller groups. So we know this from various, for example, we know that from the DNA studies that they were often quite interrelated when they, more so than Homo sapiens. So they had smaller groups. They probably didn't have the big aggregations that are defining of Homo sapiens. So I'm sort of thinking like the art must have functioned in a different way too.
Does that mean that, is there a gradient that you see between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens? Or can you make some sort of a cutoff in terms of a Homo sapien or human uniqueness?
So there are two different species, right? So we know from the several DNA studies. So the guy who just got the Nobel Prize for it, Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck. So his team and teams like that have definitely shown that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis split apart quite a while ago, but interestingly, they did have continued sort of like a limited interbreeding. So in that respect, it's sort of more blurry than you might think. And then again, you might think about if they were not human, but any other species, would we have like put them into two different species? That's a whole discussion in paleoanthropology about lumping versus putting together. So there are some people, lumpers, who think you should
splitters.
You should put them together. You should put them together. Whereas I think most people now are splitters, sort of like de facto, right? So I think they're just two different species. And it's not the case that there is a kind of threshold of, human excellence or something that Neanderthals, like, I think we really have to get out of that sort of theory thinking and just thinking about, like, how are Neanderthals, different to us, similar to us? How did they respond to their unique ecological situation? And the huge debate that continues to go is did we cause them to go extinct, like through competition, or was it just climatological bad luck? And increasingly, so people like Finlayson, they say, and at the time when he first wrote about that, it was super unpopular, they say things like, it was just bad luck.
I hope we don't have such bad luck.
Oh, I hope so too.